Joining me now is Simon Johnson, professor at MIT's Sloan School of Management, author of the spectacular book 13 Bankers, and co-author of the newly issued White House Burning. Professor, thank you for joining us. First of all, very simply, what is wrong with Tim Geithner's being on the board of the New York Fed?
Well, I think you mean Jamie Dimon.
Jamie Dimon, excuse me, Timothy Geithner. He was the president. That was a big problem too. But let's start with Jamie Dimon. Correct.
Well, there's a conflict of interest there, Elliot. Jamie Dimon is head of JP Chase, one of the largest banks in the world, the largest bank in the United States. They've had some serious operating difficulties. They've had some big losses. Those need to be investigated properly. The New York Fed is a responsible supervisor and regulator of JP Chase. So there's a big conflict of interest in having somebody who will be and is the subject of investigation also sit in a supervisory position on one of the organizations in charge of overlooking how his firm operates.
Now, I don't think most people appreciate the fact that if you look back at the board of the New York Fed over the last 10 years, you will see that it has been dominated by bankers. Why is that, and how can that have been permitted to continue?
Well, there's a long-standing arrangement for all the regional feds that comprise the Federal Reserve System that gives the bankers, local bankers, a large voice. And if you're giving local bankers a voice in Kansas or in Minnesota, that's one thing. But in New York, you're giving that voice to some of the most powerful people on Wall Street. Sandy Weill, for example, who built up Citigroup, was a key board member there. Dick Fuld, who was in charge of Lehman Brothers as it ran into the ground, was a board member of the New York Fed. And Jamie Dimon is one of the most vociferous and effective opponents of financial reform, yet he sits on the board of the New York Fed.
What you see when you look at the roster of the board members is that virtually every bank that has run into trouble, every bank that has been bailed out, has been represented on the board of the Fed. They have given themselves, in essence, the money they needed, taxpayer money, to survive. And clearly, this is a structural problem. So why hasn't anything yet happened about this? Why has there not been a real demand, a hue and cry that somebody like Jamie Dimon be forced off the board?
That's a great question, Elliot. I think it's because there hasn't been enough political attention paid to this. I think that when the attention comes onto this, as it's now coming, it will come across the political spectrum. People, when you explain to them the situation and say, "Oh, that's a bizarre anachronism to have the bankers play that role in the New York Fed and in the economy," and with regard exactly to giving themselves, or apparently giving themselves, emergency loans, I actually don't think this is going to last out the year.
Now, our Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, did make some comments the other day. He was asked about this on a PBS show, and he put this in the context of there being an appearance issue. And what he did was downplay the actual role that the board plays with respect to governance of the New York Fed. And I quoted it the other night on the show, and I was critical of him because I said, no, Mr. Geithner, it's not an appearance issue. It's a very genuine problem because the board does the most important thing imaginable, which is both to pick the president of the New York Fed, their own regulator. And as you point out in your wonderful article today, Jamie Dimon sits on the committee that sets the salaries and oversees the salaries of Fed officials. How are they possibly going to regulate him? So does Tim Geithner appreciate this fundamental tension, and what do you think he will do about it?
Well, Tim Geithner, as you mentioned before, was previously the president of the New York Fed. He knows these bankers very well. He's good friends with many of them. And I'm sure he understands that there's a real conflict of interest here. However, he did say, you're right, he did say there's a perception problem. That is typical Treasury Department code for saying time has come to fix this. And now, Tim Geithner cannot force out Jamie Dimon. That has to be done within the Federal Reserve System. But the pressure, without question, is mounting on Jamie Dimon to resign from the board of the New York Fed.
Look, both you and I are confusing the two. Maybe there's a reason for that because the two of them morphed into one person in terms of their regulatory worldview, and that may be the problem. Is, in fact, what we've just been talking about with respect to the New York Fed board symptomatic of the larger regulatory crisis we face in this nation, where there is such influence brought to bear on the regulators that they have simply not done their job?
Yes, it's exactly symptomatic and representative of a much bigger, broader problem. And this happens to be it's the tip of the iceberg or the relatively visible part of the problem. And it's the part that we can deal with in a relatively straightforward fashion. The intellectual and other forms of capture that the financial sector have pulled off are much more pervasive and need to be dealt with on that basis.
Very, very quickly, you are actually beginning a petition campaign to show public support for this. When will that start? How will that work?
Well, we hope to get it going tomorrow through change.org. We hope to make it widely available. We hope that a lot of people are going to sign on. It's actually a very reasonable and modest and moderate ask. And I'll be shocked if we don't pick up a lot of support from across the political spectrum.
Well, you're absolutely right. It should happen. It should happen. This would be the least of the reforms we need to begin to bring some genuine regulatory pressure to bear on the banks when necessary. All right, Simon Johnson, professor at MIT's Sloan School of Management, co-author of White House Burning. Great thanks for your insights and everything you've done to shed light on the financial crisis over the years.
Thank you.
Credit to the courts as due process is defended. My view coming up.